You're leaving this Thursday?
Yeah, the project in Dallas requires me to be there in person.
How long?
3 weeks, maybe more.
Sarah Monroe stood still in the ivory-tiled kitchen of her house in the suburbs outside Charleston, South Carolina. The house was perfect. A vintage-style loft, a backyard with a pear tree that bloomed white every spring, and glossy oak doors catching the warm golden sunlight. From the outside, everyone thought she was living the American dream. But the truth? She felt like she was disappearing a little more each day. At 45, Sarah was no longer the young woman who once turned heads, but she still carried a timeless elegance, soft brown curls, radiant skin, a graceful smile. The only thing missing was the light in her eyes. It didn't vanish overnight. It faded quietly, like candlelight swept by wind through a cracked window. Her husband, Mark, was a renowned architect, always busy with major projects in Texas, New York, or Colorado. His business trips used to last a few days, then stretched into weeks, then months. When he was home, he was still polite, still nice, but more like a guest being served than a partner. Every conversation between them now circled around. Did you pay the bills? Will I make it back in time for the kid's birthday? We need to replace the roof. No more real conversations. No more eye contact over a glass of wine on a weekend night. No more spontaneous morning hugs. Sarah knew she was living in a ghost marriage, a relationship alive in form but dead inside. No screaming, no obvious betrayal, but full of absence. And what hurt her most wasn't the emptiness. It was how used to it she had become. She did everything right. Woke up early, prepared breakfast, cared for the house like a living museum, sent birthday cards to her husband's friends to keep up the family image. Neighbors admired her, but no one knew that at night, when the clock ticked in that big, quiet house, she would sit on the living room floor, back against the wall, and cry in silence, as if even she was afraid to hear herself. No one teaches women how to survive a marriage that looks fine but is hollow inside. She used to think, at least he doesn't hit me, doesn't cheat, doesn't abandon me. That line repeated like a coping mechanism, but deep down, she knew it was just an excuse to convince herself she wasn't forgotten. One time, at a small gathering at a friend's house, a younger woman said, "Sarah, you always look so radiant, like you walked out of a magazine." Sarah smiled, raised her glass, and in her head echoed one sentence: "If only you knew." No one saw the part of Sarah that had shattered, the dreams postponed, the years she waited for her husband to return only to receive indifference. She once wanted to get a master's degree in counseling. She once dreamed of opening a small bookstore by the beach, but every time she spoke up, Mark would just smile slightly and say, "If you're that busy, who's going to take care of the house?" Sarah smiled back, the kind of smile generations of women had mastered, a smile of quiet compliance. The day her husband prepared for yet another trip, she stood on the porch to see him off. Sunlight streamed through the bougainvillea, casting golden patches on her shoulder. He kissed her lightly on the cheek, more like a social courtesy, then got in the car and drove off without looking back. She stood there for a long time. Her heart felt hollow, not because he left, but because she no longer felt anything when he did. Sarah Monroe, the woman who always seemed fine in the eyes of society, had become an invisible woman in her own life story. And the scariest part? She had nearly accepted living that way, if nothing had come along to break the still deceptive routine. Sarah Monroe didn't think that the change in her life would begin with the sound of suitcase wheels clacking down the staircase. "Aiden," she called out from the kitchen when she heard the door open. "Hi, Sarah," he replied, his voice deeper than before, echoing through the bright space. Aiden, Mark's stepson, had just turned 22, back from North Carolina State University for a short spring break. He was tall, walked with confidence, and carried a sense of maturity noticeably different from the last time Sarah had seen him during Christmas. Since marrying Mark, Sarah had always fulfilled the role of a proper stepmother. Never too close, never controlling, just gently creating a safe space Aiden could call home. And truly, Aiden had always been polite, kind, the kind of son anyone would hope to have in the family. But this time, when his eyes lingered on Sarah standing there drying her hands with a kitchen towel, there was something different. Not loud, not obvious. But she felt it. The instinct of a woman who had lived in silence for too long made her sensitive to even the smallest shifts. "You look really well. And I like your new hairstyle." Sarah paused for a moment. She hadn't changed much, except for tying her hair up higher because the weather was warming. But his eyes weren't talking about the hairstyle. They were talking about her, about her presence. "Thanks. Are you hungry? There are some cookies I baked this morning in the kitchen." Aiden smiled, and in that moment, something strange began to seep into the air of this usually quiet house. In the following days, Sarah noticed herself beginning to wait, not for Mark's texts or a call from an old friend, but for Aiden's footsteps on the stairs, the sound of lo-fi music playing from his Bluetooth speaker each night, or even the sight of his hoodie draped casually over the arm of the sofa. He spent more time at home than Sarah had expected. No friend meetups, no parties. Just wandering between the kitchen, the porch, or helping her take out the recycling. Little things, but enough for Sarah to realize a strange feeling growing inside her. She no longer felt invisible. One afternoon, they were tending to the backyard together, something Mark had always promised to do, but never actually touched. Sarah wore gloves, her hands covered in dirt, while Aiden pulled weeds near the fence. He turned to her with a smile. "Do you know your smile looks kind of peaceful?" Sarah blushed slightly. "Are you flirting with your stepmom?" I'm just telling the truth." That was all it took, and Sarah couldn't sleep that night. Not from fear, but because for the first time in many years, she felt like someone truly noticed the person inside. Not the role, not the responsibility, but her, Sarah Monroe. She started lingering longer in front of the mirror each morning, added a light layer of lipstick, not to attract, but to remind herself that she was still alive, not just existing. Of course, Sarah knew this was dangerous. Women like her, trapped in hollow marriages with their best years slipping by, were vulnerable, easily misled. But Aiden wasn't the kind of immature man who toyed with emotions. He cared in a calm, conscious way, the kind that, whenever she coughed lightly, he'd ask, "Have you had enough water today?" Or when she quietly folded laundry outside, he'd join her without a word. It wasn't love, maybe not even desire, but it was connection, something she thought she would never feel again. She knew it should stop here. But right at that moment, Sarah began to ask herself, did she still have the right to feel? After all these years of being just a shadow in a marriage that looked fine but was hollow inside. Aiden didn't say anything more, but every time his gaze lingered a moment too long, Sarah felt a strange wind sweep through her chest, a vague warning that if she didn't step back now, nothing would remain simple anymore. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing isn't the action, but the silent moments that still make the heart tremble uncontrollably. The wind started to pick up in the late afternoon, the kind of wind that comes with southern spring storms, both damp and cold, slipping through every crack in the house and seeping into the skin like a warning. Sarah Monroe stood by the living room window, holding a cup of tea growing cold, her eyes fixed on the backyard swaying under waves of strong wind. Mark had called a few hours earlier, just to inform her that his meetings in Dallas would be extended a few more days. He spoke in that mechanical, familiar tone, like he was reporting to an assistant, not his wife. Sarah simply responded with a soft, "Okay," then ended the call. Not a single word of concern, not a trace of longing. That night, the rain poured down as if it carried all the frustration Sarah had been suppressing for days. The drops slammed against the windows like relentless knocks from something begging to be acknowledged. She was finishing up the dinner dishes when the power went out. A sharp click, then silence. No more light, no more background music, only the sound of rain and the pounding of her own heart in the dark. "Aiden?" she called out. "Here." His voice echoed from the hallway, followed by the flicker of candlelight and his tall frame entering the kitchen. He held 2 glasses of red wine, the candlelight reflecting in his eyes like something unspoken. "I thought you might need this," Aiden said, gently placing a glass in front of her. Sarah hesitated for a second, but then she took it, nodding instead of speaking. They both sat down on the long couch in the living room, a small candle set between them like a faint thread holding on to awareness. A strange silence surrounded them, unlike the comfortable silences of the days before. This time it was thick, like someone had just shut all the emotional doors. Have you ever felt like you're disappearing? Aiden asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Sarah turned to him but didn't answer. I see you. Really, he continued. Even when no one else does, I do. She wanted to stop that sentence, wanted to change the subject, but her throat tightened, as if something long held inside had finally reached the edge of her lips. I used to think, if I ever truly disappeared, Mark might not even notice right away, she said, eyes fixed on the candle. He's not cruel, but he doesn't really see me anymore. Aiden didn't say a word. He simply reached out and gently touched her hand. Sarah flinched, but she didn't pull away. It was a touch that wasn't forceful, wasn't full of desire, but overflowed with a tenderness she had forgotten she once deserved. They sat like that, in the sound of falling rain and flickering candlelight. Every passing second, the line between right and wrong blurred like fog over an old memory. Aiden turned toward her, and his eyes no longer belonged to a young college boy. They were the eyes of a man, someone who knew what he was doing and what he wanted. Do you know how beautiful you are? He asked. Sarah opened her mouth to say something, to deny, to deflect, but no words came out. Aiden leaned closer. The fragile distance between their faces no longer existed, and when his lips touched hers, softly, slowly, almost reverently, she didn't push away. Sarah's heart pounded violently. She knew without a doubt she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. The kiss ended in silence. No justification, no regret in that moment. Only their eyes meeting, full of unnamed emotions, long-buried desires, and the fear of what was to come. Sarah stood up. I need to rest. Aiden gave a slight nod, not insisting. He remained seated in the dark like a familiar shadow that had suddenly become unfamiliar. On her way upstairs, Sarah's heart still hadn't calmed. She walked quickly, not daring to look back. But with each step, she knew everything had changed forever. Not because of a kiss, but because she had allowed herself to feel, to be touched by something deeper than loneliness. And the price of that might be very high. Sarah Monroe lay in bed that entire night, not sleeping, not dreaming, just listening to the rain that had stopped long ago, but still lingered in her chest like the slow, steady beat of a drum. The familiar room suddenly felt strange. The ceiling, once bright white, now seemed coated in a pale gray, so quiet that she could hear every broken breath. The pillow beside her remained untouched, the place where Mark was supposed to sleep, now a cold, empty space stretching across years. She closed her eyes, but instead of her husband's face, it was Aiden's that appeared. Not the face of the boy she once drove to school, but the face from last night, quiet, sincere, and slightly trembling when he touched her, as if holding something more sacred than any moral line. She should feel disgusted with herself, shouldn't she? She should be filled with guilt, shame, self-loathing. But the only thing she felt was life. A vague current seemed to course through her body, not fierce, not blazing, but awakening. As if after years of being trapped in darkness, someone had opened a door and let a little light shine on the place where she lay, quiet, worn, and forgotten. The next morning, Sarah got up early, made pancakes as usual. She was more careful with each movement, not to impress but to keep her hands busy, because if not, her mind would drift back to last night, to the moment their lips touched, gentle, silent, but intense, like a confession. When Aiden stepped into the kitchen, the morning light spilled across his shoulders, casting a figure almost surreal. He smiled softly. Smells like pancakes, just like always. Sarah didn't look up. There's syrup in the fridge, she said, her voice so calm even she found it strange. No one mentioned what had happened. No questions, no glances that recalled it. But the silence between them now wasn't the comfortable kind. It was an iceberg, and underneath it lay an ocean full of cracks. Sarah started doing odd little tasks, wiping the table more often, rearranging the spice rack, washing towels that hadn't been touched in weeks. She called it spring cleaning, but deep down she knew she was trying to escape herself, as if scrubbing the house clean could erase the trace of a kiss that had changed everything. That night, she deliberately didn't sit to watch TV with Aiden like the other nights. She said she was tired, but once in bed, she opened her phone and sat in silence for hours, the screen glowing in the dark, not waiting for a message, not hoping for a call, but torn between a part of her that wanted to end everything and another part aching to be remembered, to be named, to be seen. On Tuesday morning, while folding laundry in the laundry room, Aiden walked in with a basket of clothes. He set it down but didn't leave right away. "Are you okay?" The question came gently but struck directly into her chest. Sarah stopped. A brief silence. Then she replied, almost in a whisper, "I don't know, Aiden. I just know. I'm not the same person anymore." Aiden stepped closer, his eyes no longer filled with admiration like in the beginning. Now they held worry, guilt, and something Sarah didn't want to see: belief. "I've never seen anyone as strong as you. I know this shouldn't have happened, but I'm not sorry for seeing you." Sarah turned away, folding the last shirt, her eyes blurring with tears. Not because of love, but because for the first time in years, someone saw her pain as something real. Not weakness, not inconvenience, but something worthy of being understood. In the days that followed, Sarah tried to rebuild her emotional walls. But every time she passed the hallway, touched the door handle of the living room, or smelled the soft, woody scent from Aiden's shirt, she was pulled back to that moment. She didn't love Aiden. She couldn't. But she had opened herself, had let someone step into a space she thought was permanently locked, and now she didn't know how to go back, not just to her husband, but to herself. Sarah Monroe once thought she was still in control, that everything that had happened was just a minor slip, a touch at the wrong moment, a kiss led by emotion. But it didn't stop there. The truth was, from the moment she allowed herself to be seen, to be desired, she was no longer standing outside the story. She had become the center, and for the first time in decades, she didn't know the way out. Aiden didn't try to push anything forward. He didn't bring up the rainy night, didn't send vague texts or find awkward reasons to touch her. But it was precisely that calm silence that made Sarah spin, because it made her believe if she was the one to speak first, if she was the one who needed more, then it was she who was choosing, and then she chose. One Thursday afternoon, when sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting honey-colored patches on the floor, Sarah was slicing an apple when the knife slipped lightly across her hand. Blood welled up, dark red against the white tile. Aiden rushed over almost instantly, panic in his eyes. "Let me see." He pulled her hand under the faucet, grabbed paper towels to stop the bleeding. His hand held her wrist, firm enough to steady, gentle enough to make her feel like she was being held in something real. She looked up, their eyes meeting in a moment that stretched like a silent symphony. In that instant, the only thing that existed was the feeling of being needed. And then Aiden kissed her, this time without hesitation, without asking. That kiss was no longer a question. It was an answer both of them had known all along. Everything afterward was like a chain reaction. Not loud, not frantic, but very real. Sarah didn't remember exactly who unbuttoned first, who gasped into the other's throat, who stepped back once but moved forward twice. She only remembered one thing. There was no force, no rush, only surrender. Gentle, tender, but irreversible. They didn't speak when it ended, just lay still in a silence heavier than any justification. Sarah listened to her heartbeat pounding in her chest, each beat not from regret, but from the truth. She didn't want to stop. The following days were a new kind of existence, full of contradiction and stimulation. Sarah still woke up early, still watered the plants, still emailed the old PTA to keep up appearances for Mark's sake. But in her mind, everything circled back to one point. Aiden's eyes when he sat across from her at breakfast, the light touch of his knee under the table, and the low laugh that echoed when she told a silly story in the kitchen. One evening, while Sarah was folding a blanket in the laundry room, Aiden walked in without a word. He simply approached, placed his hand on her cheek. You don't always have to be this strong, he said softly. Sarah didn't respond, but she didn't push his hand away either. Her eyes said what her lips didn't. Don't speak of logic tonight. Not tonight. And then everything continued as it was. No plans, no promises, just two people finding each other in the gray space between right and wrong, between longing and guilt, between clarity and surrender. Sarah knew they were inching closer to the edge. But when someone has walked too far through the desert of emotion, a single drop of water is enough to make them abandon all reason. Once, Aiden said in the dark, while they lay together on the living room sofa, I know this doesn't have a future, but I've never felt more real than I do now. She didn't reply, just held his hand, a quiet way of holding on to something already slipping. Inside Sarah, two truths coexisted, a wife full of flaws and a woman rediscovering herself. She didn't seek forgiveness, because no one yet knew to forgive. But she didn't try to forget either, because a part of her, the part that survived all those years of abandonment, had been awakened. And maybe the scariest thing wasn't betrayal, but realizing there are things so right that we'd trade everything for them, even when we know they're wrong. 1 week after that final night, everything began to melt like a block of ice cracked from within. There was no loud explosion, no one shouting, no unexpected phone call or rushed letter, just a change in glances, in silences that stretched longer than usual, and in the way Aiden folded his clothes as if each crease was a reminder to himself that he was about to leave something that couldn't be named. Sarah Monroe saw it the moment he stepped out of his room with the familiar blue suitcase. You're leaving early? She asked, still drying a glass in the kitchen, her eyes clinging to every one of Aiden's movements. Yeah, my friend changed his flight. I'll catch a bus to the airport tomorrow morning. I see. Just that one word, and everything else she wanted to ask drifted away with the breath that left her lips. No one said anything more. The house became so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock sounded unbearably loud, every tick-tock like a blade tapping steadily against her chest. That evening, Sarah didn't try to avoid him. She didn't hide in the bedroom or use fatigue as an excuse. Instead, she sat by the living room window, the dim light falling over the teacup in her hands, a cup she hadn't taken a sip from in over 30 minutes. Aiden walked in, needing no invitation, no knock. They sat beside each other as they had before, but this time not to begin something, but to end it. He turned to her, his eyes for the first time not searching, not asking, just accepting. I don't regret anything, Aiden said, his voice low, slow, and so sincere it made her heart tighten. But I don't want to ruin your life either. Sarah looked directly at him, for the first time since everything began, with eyes that didn't cry but were red with restraint. My life has been broken for a long time. You're just the first person who dared to look at it. They didn't hug, didn't kiss, didn't hold hands. They just sat there, like two souls that had touched, understood each other, and knew that understanding would never be accepted beyond this door. The next morning, Sarah walked Aiden out to the porch. The sky was windless, dull gray as if it were holding back a rain that never came. The Uber stopped at the gate. The driver didn't get out, just honked softly, a cruel reminder. It was time to leave. Aiden turned back, about to say something, but then he just smiled, softly, as if to say everything would be all right. Sarah nodded. She didn't step forward, didn't hold his hand. She stood like a shadow in the doorway, not like a lover being left behind, but like a version of herself being shed with each step he took away. When the car disappeared behind the trees, Sarah finally stepped back inside. The house suddenly felt unusually large. Everything seemed in its place, yet nothing felt whole. She stood in the kitchen, unconsciously holding the cup Aiden used every morning, and suddenly felt breathless. Not from sadness, but from the emptiness. The kind of emptiness that logic or righteousness could never fill. Mark came home 3 days later. He brought a souvenir bag from Dallas, a few stories about new partners, and a half-hearted hug like an airport ritual. When Sarah asked about the trip, he only talked about the meetings, the expensive hotel, the steak at a restaurant, totally worth trying next time. He didn't notice her eyes had changed, didn't sense the weight in the air. Sarah smiled, nodded, playing her part as she had for years. But inside, everything had shifted. That night, while Mark slept, Sarah opened her phone. The screen was still blank. No message, no missed call, no promises. Only one old line from Aiden, left 3 days ago. "Take care of yourself." Sarah stared at that line as if it were the last clue to a dream that had dissolved. Then she deleted the message. Not because she wanted to forget, but because she knew she would never truly be able to. Sarah Monroe looked at herself in the mirror on a Monday morning, in the pale gray dress that Mark once called elegant. Her face was the same. No heavy makeup, neatly brushed hair, a gentle closed-lip smile. But something in her eyes was no longer the same. Perhaps because they no longer waited, no longer hoped. Just a pair of eyes that knew too much, but had no one to tell. It had been 3 weeks since Aiden left that house. Life had returned to its old rhythm. Mark went to work, came home on time, had dinner with her amid the faint clinking of dishes and hollow work stories. She still cooked, still cleaned, still answered phone calls from her mother-in-law, still smiled at the neighbors like a typical wife in the quaint old neighborhood of Charleston. The only difference was, every time she passed by the living room, where candlelight once flickered on that fateful rainy night, she felt like she was walking past a piece of her soul that had been peeled away. Not out of regret, no longer out of shame, but from the pain of awakening. Sarah was no longer the woman who buried herself in the shell of stability. And what pierced her heart most was realizing, once someone has felt what it means to be truly seen, they can never go back to living invisible again. One evening, while Mark was watching the news and she sat at the old dining table, she opened an old notebook she had written in during the time she dreamed of opening a seaside bookstore. The crooked handwriting was still there, plans for renting a location, ideas for designing wooden shelves, the name Sea and Soul. She had written those lines 15 years ago, and it was with her own hands that she had closed it, hiding it in a drawer like a child's game with no chance of coming true. She closed the notebook, placed it on the table. No tears. No regrets. Just the truth. She had spent too many years sacrificing for something that had never truly named her as a partner. Aiden didn't text again, didn't send a greeting, didn't leave anything behind except a vivid memory like a burn on the skin, fading over time but never ceasing to hurt. And strangely, Sarah didn't blame him, because he never promised anything. He only gave her one thing no one else had, the feeling of existing, not as a wife, a stepmother, or a keeper of the household flame, but as Sarah, a woman with pain, with longing, with twists in her heart needing someone to place a hand on and say, "I see you." And she understood that the greatest betrayal wasn't the kiss under candlelight, nor the times they held each other in silence, but that she had allowed herself to live truthfully, while her marriage was merely a performance. Mark had never suspected, not because he trusted her too much, but because he never looked deep enough to see she could change. To him, Sarah was a constant, a steady anchor, someone he could leave and return to without ever asking what inside her might be breaking. The truth was, she didn't need him to know, didn't need anyone to judge or forgive, because the harshest punishment wasn't being found out. It was having to live every day beside someone who never realized they had lost a version of their wife they never truly understood. One other morning, while Mark read the paper and ate soft-boiled eggs, Sarah asked, "Have you ever thought that maybe you're living beside someone you don't really know?" Mark raised his eyebrows, looked up. "What do you mean?" Sarah smiled softly. "Nothing." Then she stood up, poured more coffee, as if she hadn't said anything at all. But inside, she knew. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a conclusion. Sarah Monroe was no longer the woman who stepped onto the porch to see her husband off on a business trip with empty eyes. She was the one quietly closing chapters of her life that no longer belonged to her. She wasn't sure if she would leave this marriage, not sure if she could love again. But she knew one thing for certain. She would never again live as if she didn't deserve to be seen, to be touched, or to be loved deeply.